Welcome to Mershman Seeds Cup of Joe. On this episode, hear Turk's prediction for 2023. We attended the Iowa State University Crop Advantage Fair in Burlington, Iowa on Thursday. Here a summary of the day and the topics we're focusing on in 2023.
Hi, this is Joe Mershman. Welcome to Mershman Seeds Cup of Joe. Today we have Ben, Lynn, and Turk. Turk, you missed last week's prediction episode, so we're going to start with you because everybody wants to know where the markets are going and what's going to happen here.
So my predictions for this year are very similar to last year. I'm predicting that you have the opportunity to sell $6.50 corn off the combine and $15 soybeans.
All right. I'm going to go call my broker right now.
Now, those may not be around very long, so when you get the opportunity to do it, you should take advantage.
I think that those are good numbers. Let's hope we can hit them. Now, this week we had a big meeting in Burlington, Iowa, working with Iowa State University. It's called the Crop Advantage Series, and Mershman Seeds as well as the Iowa Corn Growers sponsored the meeting, and then of course we couldn't do it without the Iowa State speakers. And we had some of the top speakers from the college down to discuss various topics that are very timely to farmers. So I'm going to turn this over to Ben to lead the discussion about some of the key speakers and some of the key notes that we thought would be worth passing on to you.
Yeah, so one of the main keynotes was Darren Mueller, and he is the plant pathology. He's in the plant pathology sector there. He predominantly works with soybeans, but the presentation that he gave was on tar spot with corn. And tar spot is a big buzzword in ag, and everybody is aware of what it is. And he did a nice job laying out the background behind it. But he had a handful of key takeaways that I kind of wanted to talk about that maybe weren't new news, but it's important news on what to be thinking about if tar spot's in your area. And it is for probably the northern half of our sales footprint. So 2018 and 2021 were predominant heavy tar spot years. And some of the main reasons for those is the amount of humidity that we had in those years. So even though they were potentially a dry year, the humidity was such that we had enough leaf wetness for tar spot to exist. So leaf wetness is the key contributor towards whether or not we are going to have a bad year. And his easiest way for a farmer or anybody, an agronomist out there that's out there looking, is count the number of days and keep track in the month of June, July, and August when the pathogen can infect. Late June is probably the earliest that we've seen infection. Count the number of days that your shoes are wet when you're walking out to the mailbox, you're walking out to the rain gauge, or you're walking out in the morning, and how long that wetness has lasted. That shows you how wet the leaves are on the corn plant for an extended period of time.
Yeah, he kind of indicated like 10 o'clock. If you're walking out and at 10 o'clock, grass is still wet, and your shoes are wet, that your corn leaves are wet, and it's perfect environment for infection.
Correct. And one of the times that he talked about is one of the reasons that tar spot is so hard to get a grip on is because of this latency period. And the latency period is the time that the fungal spores actually infect the leaf versus the time that you actually see your first fruiting body on that ear leaf. The little black tar spot itself is 12 to 14 days. So before that corn plant, before the naked eye can even see that infection or the fruiting body, that leaf has already been infected. So if you take a low number like, let's say each fruiting body produces 100 spores. There's way more spores than that. But if each one of those fruiting bodies produces 100 spores, and then that can magnify, you have this exponential growth of what can happen from the time period that you see the first speck on the lower leaves of the canopy to what can happen in, 12 to 14 days after that, because there's already been an exponential amount of fruiting bodies out there. So that's why it's so important to know how much humidity we're seeing, how much leaf wetness we're seeing, and constantly be scouting for the first specks, because once the first specks start to happen, that's when we need to start pulling the trigger on what fungicides that we're going to be using.
Ben, he even said basically it looks like a little drop of tar on that leaf initially. and he said to take your finger and wet it and rub it. If it doesn't rub off, it's tar spot. If it does rub off, it's insect poop. But use a different finger the next time you check the next leaf. Is his suggestion.
Yep. He had
that was a good tip.
Yep, he had a little bit of humor there as well. So we know that the tar spot survives in the soil residue. That's not something that is anything new. But when we're talking about how do we control this narrative, he was like, if you're going to be baling corn stalks or you're going to be burying that residue with tillage, it's like rearranging the chairs on the ship of the Titanic. And those are his words. So when you think about that, they can see a statistical difference in the amount of tar spot that's coming off, but there's enough inoculum that's in the air, and there's enough inoculum locally that really it's more of how we control it once we got it. And the control methods right now are fungicides and choosing the correct varieties that are the most tolerant.
So even if you manage the residue that has tar spot on it, you're not really making too much of a change.
Correct.
It's still going to blow in from the neighbors or somewhere.
Correct.
So yeah, that makes sense. And I think the key thing that if you haven't had tar spot, and 2 years ago it was really bad over in Champaign County, Illinois, and we have a good dealer over there that told us what would happen. And Darren did a real good job showing a picture where, here's the infection, and 2 weeks later the corn plant's completely dead. I mean, just dead. And then what happens is that corn plant tried to finish filling that ear, takes every nutrient out of the stalk that's in there because the leaves are already dead. And guess what happens when you take all the nutrients out of the leaves and the stalk? It falls over. So over in Champaign County 2 years ago, they had to drop their bean heads off and put the corn heads on and race to get the corn out because every day they were snapping over and going down because of tar spot. And it just goes to show that what was the yield loss when you have really bad conditions? Wasn't it close to 50 bushels per acre?
Yeah.
It can be that bad.
Correct.
So it's a difference between making a profit and losing money on a corn crop. So definitely a disease, and I'm sure you're going to give us some suggestions. Okay, we're going to scout for tar spot. How do we manage it?
Correct. So they had different trials out, and they were looking for disease indexes somewhere between 3 to 5%, and they were evaluating on the untreated check, and they were evaluating different fungicides. And when you are in a high pressure situation, some of the things he talked about was the 2 mode of action products. So there's 3 basic modes of action for fungicides. There's your SDHIs, your QOIs, and your DMIs. And the 2 mode of action products, when you have a combination of any of those 2 modes of action, you are 5 bushel better than the untreated check in higher pressure situations. In the 3 mode of action products, where you have 1 of each one of those products, you're 7 bushel better than the untreated check in the studying that they have been doing on that product. So when he lays out his entire screen and it's got all these different fungicides that they tested against, they look at levels of tar spot reduction, and then they look at the yield components. And we are not biased to anything here, but when I look at what those charts look like and I try to pick the 3 that they both match up in disease incidence drop and their yield, the Revitec, Dolaro, and Veltima both rose to the top. And both of those are good products that, I would think after looking at the Crop Protection Network and the extra data, you don't take my word necessarily for it, but all of this data is published at the end of every year once they get done looking at all these studies from multiple universities. Those 3 products are 3 products that if tar spot was the main concern for what you're trying to control, those 3 products both rose to the top or had the highest yield increase towards the end of it.
That's probably what, our second year of seeing university data that those 3 have risen to the top for the second year in a row, or some component of the 3.
Yeah, and Dolaro Complete might have been in there as well. So I don't have pictures of what the slides look like, but it's one of those things where it's definitely worth going back and looking at what the data suggests.
And if you're planning to use a fungicide, which many farmers do, they do it as a standard operating procedure, but you'd want to order those products early because we're still not out of that supply chain problem with fungicides yet. So, if you're planning it, you want to get it on order.
Correct. So in heavy pressure situations like in 2021 and 2018, it wasn't as bad as like what you were talking about over in Illinois, but they saw an 18 to 31% yield response based on the different timings that they were working on. And in low pressure situations, they did not see as big of an economic benefit. They could see a negative $25.80 to up to maybe $1.60 positive response. So it's one of those deals where scouting is obviously going to be very important, and knowing when that first pustule becomes exposed, that's when we have to start looking at when to start making those applications.
So another thing they made a point of was that we usually get a lot of humidity when we get winds out of the south. Gulf Mexico moisture blows up. So if our winds are more prevailing to the west and northwest, we're typically drier. So if we're consistently getting southerly flow, that's usually going to bring that moisture up, and you're going to see that in that dew on the grass in the morning and things like that. So those are things to watch during those key months.
Correct. No, a lot of good information, a lot of little tidbits on what to look for, and potential products that may be the most effective against it. So that's what I had from the tar spot conversation anyway.
A lot to take in. Lynn?
Yeah, so I'm going to piggyback on the fungicide conversation onto the bean side. Something that I found pretty interesting that Darren talked about was we really need to take a look at our premix. We're picking our fungicides for next year. That the different modes of actions are fine, but what especially with Frog Eye and Septoria in his conversation is that we're really limited into our frat groups that actually have efficacy on these particular diseases. So when we're looking at anything with a QOI, at this point, Frog Eye has completely blown through that frat group. It's for all intents and purposes useless when we come to Frog Eye. So now we're left down to 2. In certain products, there's a SDHI, wouldn't call it resistance, but lack of efficacy against Frog Eye. So when we're looking at premixes, we really want to look at our groups and our actives and make sure that we're picking products that have 2 modes of action. Not to pick on Revitech, it had really good response, and as far as lowering the incident, but right now, as we look at it, it's a one-trick pony on the mode of action that actually is efficacious against Frog Eye. Product that stood out that seemed pretty consistent was Lucento. It looked like it had very good yield response. Disease pressure went down, and then the economic gains seemed to be pretty decent with that product. So when we're looking at fungicides with beans, very similar to looking at tar spot, we want to look at our disease pressure. When we have high disease pressure, all the fungicide had a response, no matter what product you picked. When we get to the lower instances, we have to be a little bit careful there because our economic return might not be as great. The yield responses were anywhere from -4 to +2. So fungicide seems to be a very common practice in soybeans. So the biggest thing that I would say is make sure we're going out and looking at our disease pressure, making sure that we're finding the right product to attack these Frog Eye particularly, because we're potentially down to one frat group that works really well and limited on the second, and the third doesn't work at all. So with that's just preservation of fungicide that, once we blow through this, it's could be pretty a long time, I guess, before we find something else that's coming down the pike.
One thing that he mentioned that was kind of interesting about that is with fungal species, there is no fitness penalty.
Correct.
So when you talk fitness penalty when in weed control, when you add Roundup to 2,4-D, there is a component of Roundup, whether that be the surfactant or the active ingredient itself, that actually there's a little bit of synergy, or the Roundup is still working to some degree on that. So when you add a second effective mode of action, 1 + 1 may equal 2.5 because that Roundup isn't completely useless at that point. Or I guess it would be more like 1 + 1 is equal to 1.5, with Roundup being almost like 0 in that instance, because there's a resistance because Roundup won't kill that weed by itself. So that QOI class of fungicide is essentially it's 100% resistant in every field in the state of Iowa that they pulled frog eye scores on. And he goes, really, that's the only thing that we're targeting as a fungus in the field that you're actually trying to attack. But there is zero fitness penalty. It does not work. There's no need for it to be in the there's no need for it to be in the mix when you are trying to attack the fungal diseases that are out in the field.
Correct.
I had two things that I picked up. One of them was the fact that they did all these multiple applications. They did early, late, but ended up being R3. No matter what you do, if you do R3, you're going to probably have the best positive results. And the other things, maybe a slight advantage, but for the most part, R3 is going to carry the load for when you should get your timing down on your fungicide. The other thing too on frog eye is a disease, and Ben, you help me out here if I say something incorrectly, but it's usually a southern disease. In other words, we typically in Iowa with this, frog eye, I'm not even familiar with it, but they're finding it almost in all the counties now. So it's sneaking up on us just like a white mold is going south, frog eye is going north. We do have soybean varieties that do have high levels of tolerance to it, but most of it's in our southern germplasm. But we're starting to get some products as we're coming off the assembly line. I know that we worked a major look at genetics here this past week, Ben and I, and we're seeing some of the group 2s and early 3s now having frog eye tolerance. So that we'll tack it from that side too.
Yep.
I'd say anecdotally around here, we've found frog eye, but it's come at such a late period of time that there really isn't a quote unquote yield penalty if you didn't treat it with a fungicide. Septoria, on the other hand, I mean, we could probably go to every single field here in the Midwest and find that at some level, most of the time it doesn't progress far enough along that we run into too big of issues. But once again, anecdotally, a lot of guys have made the switch to fungicide as a common practice in their soybeans the last 3 years. All of them have seen a yield response. And this just kind of goes to back it up that most of them probably have some kind of disease that's affecting the soybean, and we're making timely applications and making a good economic return on the application.
One thing about frog eye, when you have a heavy infection, I mean, it literally just destroys the leaf.
Yep.
And then once you destroy the leaf, you have no food reserves that are going to that pod. So the earlier it hits, the more devastating it is to the soybean yield. So, because all your nutrients out of the leaves drain into the pod and fill the pod, and that's how the pod creates those beans. So it is a very critical disease to manage. And it, again, us northern folks are just learning more about it because we don't see it that often, but it is coming this way.
Well, I think it's one of those diseases that gets left behind and kind of behind the curtains, because when you make the fungicide application, and we've seen it in the South, we've even seen it up here, you can see to the line sometimes where that fungicide stops if you block a field out. Probably what you're seeing when this is green and this is yellow is the progression of frog eye, cercospora, and septoria all taking that plant out. So those three fungal diseases added together, it's a combination of those three, because it seems like once one disease starts and weakens that plant, it doesn't have the ability to fight it off as fast, and then boom, you cut 2 weeks out of your last fill period, and that's where your 3, 4, 5, 6 bushel advantage comes from.
Yep. It's very, very important. So that's good. A lot of good information. Over next week, we'll be recapping the Ag Land Expo. We'll be attending that on Tuesday of next week, which is the very prestigious meeting in Des Moines, put on by Steve Brewer's company, the People's Company. And they have some of the best speakers in the country. It can be done by Zoom. So those of you that haven't heard of it, you might want to check it out. You can still get in on it yet because it's next Tuesday. So we'll give you a recap on that. And the following week, we plan to have a recap from the meeting in Kansas City called FarmCon, which is becoming very prestigious too in the Midwest for breaking new ideas and information. So next 2 episodes of Cup of Joe is going to have, the winter meeting circuit, some of the top meetings in the country that are bringing new ideas and keeping you ahead so you can be profitable. So that brings us to the corny jokes, and really no theme of this week's corny jokes other than just corny jokes, okay? All right. Why did the robber jump into the shower? Why did the robber jump into the shower? Because he wanted a clean getaway. He wanted a clean getaway.
Yep.
When does a duck wake up? When does a duck wake up? At the quack of dawn. At the quack of dawn.
Yep.
All right, this is my personal favorite, okay? How do you make an octopus laugh? How do you make an octopus laugh? With 10 tickles. With 10 tickles. Say it. I actually got a smile from Ben. You know, when you get a smile from Ben, you know, you at least had one that was halfway decent. Anyhow, thank you. We all appreciate your business this past year. We hope everybody survived the new year and ready for 2023. And we hope that you and your family are safe and healthy. And we'll see you next week. Take care.